Doug, I want to ask you a question here on the Russian tactical performance. Now, many people said at the beginning of the war that Russia was terrible tactically. They made all these hideous decisions, but then later on, now then they're making a little progress, but they're still pretty bad. How do you see the Russian tactical performance in the beginning, and how do you see it now? Is there an advancement and a change?
No, I think there has been advancement, and there have been substantial changes. The Russians came in with certain expectations, assumptions that turned out to be false. They were prepared for something different from what happened to them. And it took until probably May or June for President Putin to come to the conclusion that there would be, at least for the present, no solution to the problem. And that's when you had other general officers that came in, and you had changes in leadership at every level. I mean, there were lieutenant colonels that were rotated out, colonels rotated out. You saw a different approach to warfare. And that approach has evolved tremendously in terms of how they fight and what they use to fight. And now I think if you were to walk into a Russian brigade headquarters, and they still fight largely as brigade groups, although they may be a little larger than what we've had in the past, and also in some cases smaller. And they have figured out that as you go through this process of fighting, that you have this long checklist of things that you absolutely must do, or you're at risk of being destroyed by your enemy. And the Ukrainians have proven to be very good soldiers. Now, they're living in the Cold War structure for the most part. They're backward tactically because of us, but they're still very good fighters.
Yeah.
And I think what the Russians learned was, well, first thing, you have to establish your dominance over the area in terms of intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance. You have to know what you're dealing with. You have to have a picture on the ground in real time of what's out there. And then you carefully place all of your strike systems to where they can actually contribute in different ways. In other words, whether it's automatic mortars, or 152 millimeter artillery, or larger, or tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, rocket artillery, whatever it is. And then, of course, the heavy use of unmanned systems, both for reconnaissance and strike. All of these things were integrated into what I would call all arms warfare. Now, the Russians used this term back in the Soviet period. They talked about all arms armies. Well, the notion of all arms has moved from the army level down to the tactical level, so that someone on the battlefield can designate a target, and the decision-making regarding what weapon to use against the target, the speed with which it has to arrive, and what it has to do when it arrives, all of those questions are being answered very quickly, to the point where cruise missiles are launched from the Black Sea within a minute or two, and they arrive on target in 4 or 5 minutes thereafter. The speed of the decision-making, the speed of the response is mind-blowing. It's very rapid. It's very decisive. Now, you know that I wrote a great deal in the past about the criticality of this, and tried to push this notion of an ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, strike and maneuver and sustainment as part of an integrated package. I think the Russians have done that. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it works. Now, the other thing is, in warfare does one of two things. It either improves the force over time or it destroys it. The Russian force survived. If the force survives, new leadership emerges, new understanding takes root, a new culture emerges. Then the force goes on to greater success. That's what's happened with the Russians. And they now have what I would call a very successful, largely professional force. Now, we in the West are very smug and arrogant. And we say, oh, well, they're terrible. You were so much better. And I say, just look at these Russians. I've heard this many times from people. The Russians do things differently from the way we and the Europeans do business. That doesn't make them incapable. It doesn't make them incompetent. Simply makes them different. The Russians are doing well, is what I think we should conclude.
And in fact, there was an article by retired Lieutenant Colonel Alex Verschinen recently in the Royal United Services Institute, where he basically addressed an issue that many in the West say that, oh, well, because Russia hasn't taken a lot of territory here, that proves that they're no good and they haven't learned anything at all. But he argues that they're actually fighting a different kind of war, to your point here, to where they're actually focused not on gaining large amounts of territory, but on destroying the enemy's ability to resist. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between those two?
Well, remember, during the First World War, if you look at the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians and the Austrians and the Russians, once Warsaw fell, there was an attempt and then ultimately success in gaining control of the Baltic littoral. But besides those territories, which the Germans regarded as strategically essential to them, the rest of Russia and Ukraine were largely ignored because these vast territories in and of themselves had no value. And instead, what occurred was that the Russians then dashed themselves to pieces against German defenses. They had some modest short-term success against the Austrians in the south with the Brusilov offensive, but it was ultimately rolled back in any case. It was too late in the war for the Russians to make any real headway. And I think the Russians understood that they were in a somewhat similar position, that once they gained control of most of the territory that was historically Russian, not all of it, but certainly most of it, and the Russian-speaking population, I think they decided to go over to the defense until they had a well-equipped, well-trained, well-officered army, which they now have. And it took probably longer than President Putin would have liked, but it's worked. And that defense fulfilled its mission, which was to become impregnable. Just as the German defenses in the Eastern Front were impregnable to the Russian defenses were impregnable to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians stupidly obliged and dashed themselves to pieces to the point where they have nothing left.
And so now then, do you see Russia's, I guess their new, or maybe it's not new, but their current operational art to be able to continue to push in the west, in the east along that 600-mile-kilometer front and possibly open up a northern one? Are they going to be able to succeed on that with their new capabilities?
Well, I think so, because the Ukrainians can no longer mount the defensive in the way they could in the past. They don't have either the works on the ground, the millions of mines, and the personnel to sacrifice. Remember, they made the same stupid mistake that Hitler made in World War II, ordering their forces to defend everything, every inch of ground to the bitter end. Yeah. Well, that's a prescription for certain failure. We Americans have never learned this lesson, by the way. Terrain in and of itself has no value. Terrain is only valuable if it gives you an advantage on the battlefield. The Russians understand that. So if the terrain gives you an advantage, hold on to it, use it as long as it's useful. That means the enemy then confronts attrition. It can be attrited, and that's what's happened. And when the terrain has done its job and you no longer need it, you move on to something else. In other words, ground is something you drive over, walk over, fly over, but in and of itself, it has no value unless it gives you a real advantage tactically, operationally, and ultimately strategically. And that's what the Russians have done so well. They've understood that. We're the ones that are saying, well, they only took 20%, they failed. No, they took what was needed, just as the Germans did in 1914. And ultimately, remember, the Germans won the First World War in the East. The Russians collapsed. That was the lesson.